Hi there. My name is Annie. I am one of the registered dietitians with the KU8 Management Program, and I'm going to be walking you through another binder lesson this week. This week we are going to be covering healthy cooking. And I figured that because there's so many different directions we could go with tips and tricks to improve our cooking skills or make our meals a little bit healthier, I'm going to narrow it down to 5 essential tips for healthy cooking. So that's what I'm going to be walking you through today. And then I'll also include those 5 tips at the end of the video as a recap, so you're able to save that information if you need. And let's get started. So tip number 1, reduce salt, sugar, and fat where you can when you are cooking. Those are 3 ingredients that we can manipulate, and there are good substitutions available for those ingredients. And we also know the health benefits of reducing salt, sugar, and fat in terms of chronic disease risks such as diabetes and stroke. So how do we reduce salt, sugar, and fat? Let's cover each individual ingredient here. So reducing sugar. This is something to where you could just cut the recommended amount of sugar in half, or maybe cut it by thirds, and then maybe spice the dish a little bit more. So for example, if you're baking, maybe using some of those sweeter spices such as cinnamon or nutmeg or even vanilla. Or you could also opt for a sugar substitute. And the brand that I personally love for baking is called Swerve. So it's a sugar substitute that still tastes sweet, but it doesn't impact blood sugar as table sugar would, and it's much lower in calories. Second, how to reduce sodium in cooking. So we can easily reduce sodium by using flavor blends or spice blends that have no sodium added, or really paying attention to nutrition labels like we've talked about in one of our other videos, to make sure that you're using low sodium products. So that goes for especially any types of broth or soy sauce, any seasonings, really looking at that label to make sure that they have very low or no sodium added. Additionally, just making sure that you're not adding salt while you're cooking without even tasting it. Try to add other seasonings aside from salt while cooking, and then as you're garnishing the dish, so we avoid opting for the salt shaker altogether. Last, how to reduce fat. So probably the best ways that you're going to reduce fat are by paying attention to oils and butters. Think, do I really need this much that this recipe calls for? For example, if you're baking and it calls for a certain amount of butter, you could actually cut that amount in half and then do a half cup of unsweetened applesauce as a substitute. Similarly with oil, if it calls for oil, consider, could I just cook this in a non-stick skillet? Is there another way that I could maybe flavor these vegetables that I'm going to be roasting, like with a low fat or low sodium beef broth? So paying attention to, do I need to add these added fats such as butter and oil? And if I do think I need that extra flavor, are there other substitutes out there that I could be using? And then also making sure that the proteins you are choosing are low fat. So there are leaner cuts of meat that you can use. For example, instead of doing a pork shoulder, you could do a pork tenderloin. Or instead of doing 80-20 ground beef, you could do 93-7 ground beef. So pay attention to nutrition labels again, and that will actually show you the difference in fat in different cuts of meat and then different types of proteins, such as beef compared to poultry. So get in the habit of trying to choose a leaner cut of meat. And a good tip for that is any meat with the words round or loin on the end are going to be leaner cuts. So pay attention to that when you're, at the butcher section at the store. And then also just look at labels when you're doing ground beef. Can you swap that out for a leaner ground beef? Could you do a poultry or a seafood instead? So first tip, we want to reduce sugar, fat, and salt in our cooking wherever possible. Tip number 2, we want to make healthy substitutions. This is something that will come more naturally to you as you get in the habit of looking at your favorite recipes and seeing if there are some healthy substitutions you can make. But I want to walk you through a few examples that I think are really easy substitutions that you can do. First and foremost, if you or your loved ones love to eat pasta, considering switching out a white pasta for a whole grain option or a protein-based option such as lentil pasta. Second, again, if your family loves casseroles or pasta or really hearty dishes like that, see if you can even cut back on the starch or the noodle by maybe a third and really bulk up the recipe with vegetables. So a great example of this would be if you love tuna casserole, maybe you do just slightly less noodles in that dish, but instead you replace or add in a cup of peas or broccoli, something to add some color to the dish. Also, if a recipe calls for full fat dairy or a higher fat meat like we've talked about, see if you can replace those. So oftentimes you could do non-fat milk or non-fat yogurt if your recipes call for those items, or if a recipe calls for, like we've talked about, 90 or 80-20 ground beef, see if you can just opt for a leaner option in terms of protein as well. So the benefit of doing these substitutions is not only are we reducing calories, but oftentimes we can add in nutrients, especially if you can find ways to add more fruits, vegetables, or lean protein to the dish, and then hoping to remove excess fat, sugar, and salt, like we kind of talked about earlier. Tip number 3, cut back on ingredients if you can. First and foremost, if a dish calls for high-calorie toppings, such as shredded cheese, croutons, whipped topping, items like that that are going to be really high in fat, see if you can do without those or reduce how much you're using. See if you'll just like the dish without the toppings. Second, be mindful of condiments. So maybe consider having one of your favorite condiments, let's say if you're having a hamburger, but try not to do multiple high-calorie condiments such as mayo and cheese and barbecue sauce. Those items can really add up. So either measure out your condiments that you're using, pay attention to portion size with those, or see if you can cut back altogether. Tip number 4, be smart about your cooking methods. So essentially this tip is all about finding ways to cook your food that can still be flavorful and easy without opting for frying our food. We really want to move away from frying our foods because that really adds a lot of excessive saturated fat and calories to our dishes. So I encourage you to utilize other cooking methods, such as using an air fryer, a pressure cooker, roasting, broiling, poaching, or even baking your food. Additionally, you can also just saute your food on the stove, maybe with just a tablespoon of water, or even just using a non-stick cooking pan, so you don't have the need to add added extra butter and oil. Last but not least, tip number 5, be mindful of portion sizes. So no matter how hard we try to make healthy substitutions and to use healthy cooking methods, there are still going to be some of our favorite dishes that are still more calorically dense and that might still have added fat and sugar. In these instances, it's important just to slow down when you're eating and really pay attention to how full you are and how hungry you are. This way, you can be really mindful about how much you're serving yourself and being able to stop before you're overly full. So, be mindful when you're sitting down to a meal, and even measure out your food if that helps you get a really good visual of what a healthy portion size is. Additionally, if you plan to go out to eat, plan ahead, look at the menu, and really be aware of which menu items might have more calories, fat, and sodium compared to some healthier options. That way you feel like an informed consumer and can make a healthy decision.
All right, so we are going to recap those 5 healthier cooking tips. Number 1, reduce salt, sugar, and fat while cooking. Number 2, make healthy substitutions. Number 3, cut back on some ingredients, especially toppings and condiments. Number 4, change cooking techniques. And number 5, downsize portions. Hopefully this was helpful for you, and I will see you next time. Bye, everyone.